President-elect Joe Biden's choices to lead key federal regulatory and energy agencies, choices that include a North Carolinian named Michael Regan to head the EPA, well, all those choices could spell trouble for North Carolina farmers, landowners, and businesses. Now, our state's former lead regulator, Dr. Don Vaart, now a senior fellow at the Locke Foundation, joins me now to explain what could be ahead, not only for our state, but for the entire country due to a Biden administration. Don, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Before we talk about the president-elect's choices for these key agencies, congratulations are in order to you because you have been reappointed to a key scientific advisory board for the federal EPA. Congratulations. Tell us what you do.
Well, it's a large group of some 40-odd scientists from around the country, and what the board is actually, it's a FACA board, so it's a very formalistic. But what we do is essentially advise the administrator of the EPA on scientific questions. Now, those questions can be asked by the administrator, or they can even be put forward by the board itself. And essentially, we put reports together and make recommendations.
And this is your second term. You served one. Apparently you didn't offend anybody. They asked you back. So you will be serving for another 3 years, I believe.
That's correct.
You said something, Don, that I think is important for our listeners to know. I mentioned that you are the former lead regulator here in North Carolina. You were the secretary of the Department of Environmental Quality during the Pat McCrory years when he was governor. But you are a scientist, and that is important. I know that you consider yourself not only an educated scientist with multiple degrees, but also an environmentalist. Some people might think, how is that possible, being that you are a free marketer? You're more on the conservative side. Help us understand that.
Well, it's actually, for those of us who actually care about the environment for the sake of the environment, not for political purposes, we recognize that the only way you can have a robust environmental management program is to have a robust economy. And the two really you don't see the kind of environmental protections we have here in this country in countries that don't have the kind of economy we've got. So it doesn't make sense.
And in fact, here in North Carolina, another one of your roles is that you sit on a key board here in our state regarding environmental management. Tell us about that.
Right. That's the board that actually has the authority to pass rules for the department. And that's a very formalistic group, and it has representatives that have been put on there by both the governor and the General Assembly, and it's a very good group. It has a lot of robust discussions.
Obviously, your background, your experience, your education, you're highly sought after. You're here at the Locke Foundation as a senior fellow doing a lot of writing. By the way, you can follow that at johnlocke.org. So interesting that the new presidential administration, Joe Biden, has been selecting key position holders. One of them actually is your successor here in North Carolina at the Department of Environmental Quality. His name is Michael Regan. He has been the Secretary of DEQ here, and Mr. Biden has selected him to head the EPA. What's your reaction to that? What do you expect from a Regan EPA?
Well, first, I'm happy to see a state regulator be selected for that role. I think they're the best suited. His next step is to be confirmed, and that's not going to be without controversy. You might recall he was part of the Atlantic Coast Pipeline debacle, which led to an investigation. And there were whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, that really didn't have very good optics. That was an agreement between Duke and the pipeline and the administration, and essentially gave $58 million for a permit, and even it even required a refund if the permit was later rescinded. Whether you're a Democrat or Republican, nobody likes to see permits for sale. So that may be a controversy that he may see in the Senate confirmation hearing. But overall, his interest, I think, is in environmental justice, very difficult topic. It essentially seeks to apply environmental restrictions in a non-uniform way based on demographics. It's been around for a long time. Efforts have been around for a long time. So far, there's been very little in the way of rules, and so there's going to be a lot of interest, continued interest in that area. He had, in North Carolina, he pushed for a program to permit the agricultural industry, in particular livestock operations. He misstepped on some procedural issues, and that permit program ended up being stayed by a court. I'm sure that'll get worked out. So there's been some miscues. The coal ash settlement, where he essentially handed over the ratepayers to Duke. I think that's problematic. But all in all, I think the reason he was selected was his interest in environmental justice. What you're going to see in a Biden administration is you're going to see somewhat similar to when Carol Browner had the position in the White House. I think Gina McCarthy will be sort of the quarterback, and their focus is going to be trying to get some kind of legislation through that looks like the Green New Deal, which, as we've talked about, is less to do about the environment and more to do with our economic model.
You mentioned Gina McCarthy. At the point that you and I are talking, it looks like the president-elect has selected her to be essentially a climate change czar, if you like that phrase. Also, it looks like Mr. Biden is selecting Jennifer Granholm to run the energy department. So you're looking at Michael Regan, Gina McCarthy, Jennifer Granholm. Fair to say that that would be a group of like-minded people who would be interested in restricting the rights of North Carolina farmers, landowners, etc.?
I think you're going to see a large part of their program to be focused on wealth redistribution and under the guise of clean energy. But you're going to see a real effort at the EPA specifically on rolling back the definition of the waters of the U.S. And that's something that the current administrator, Andrew Wheeler, worked very hard to better define, one that's more consistent with the law. I think you're going to see a return to the Obama approach where they're really trying to extend the reach of their authority. And what you're going to see in North Carolina and other places is much of our land use to be federally dictated.
Well, agriculture specifically, so important to North Carolina. Are you expecting that there will be an attempt to somehow cut back on the ability of North Carolina farmers to grow, to produce, to raise crops and animals, etc., to help feed the world?
Absolutely. There are provisions under the Green New Deal which speak to that, to restrict farming. But an easier approach, which is the one the Obama administration selected, was to prohibit expansion of farm use without federal intervention and through the waters of the U.S. Definition. I think that's where you're going to see the earliest action.
Well, once these folks are in place, and of course they do have to go through Senate confirmation, at least Mr. Regan does, in order to be head of the EPA, correct?
Gina McCarthy does not, which I think that's telling. That's where Carol Browner ended up being slid in because of her. She had some very controversial background and issues, and so that's telling.